I was a recon platoon leader through the Tet Offensive, where we had the most casualties at any time, which was, I think, 18,000 were killed that year. In 1 month, I think it was January, we lost over 2,000 killed. In 1 week, we had over 200 killed, not in our unit, but overall. And when you talk about people, it's almost, they can't really comprehend it. I said, you forget that we over 50,000 were killed in action. And it was a close-in gunfight war. You were not killed by artillery, not killed by IEDs. You were killed by rifles in close-in combat. So we lost a lot of officers because of the officers at that time, I believe, were taught to lead from the front. I know we were in Grange's battalion. And when I think back on Vietnam, I was actually in 2 wars. The first war I was in was 1968, and the Army at that time was an incredibly professional Army. The leaders were great. I mean, Dave Grange was my battalion commander. I mean, he became legendary after that. Our company commanders were all first or second, most of them were second tours. Our senior NCOs, I made a comment earlier, all of my NCOs were on their second tours. My platoon sergeant won the Silver Star on his first tour. It really, really, really professional. My second tour was a different Army. I came in and I said, this isn't the Army that I came over with the first time. And it was through because of either the draftees or the war actions against the war, whatever. But it was a different kind of Army than the first Army.
Something changed.
Something changed dramatically in the couple of years I was gone. The 101st again was an airborne division. That was a volunteer division. You didn't get to the 101st just because you were assigned there. You had to ask to go. I remember seeing at that time, and I have to go fast forward, the movie Platoon had come out in the 70s, and we'd gone to see it, and my wife asked at the time, was that like in Vietnam? I said, no. I said, they took every single bad thing that ever happened in the United States Army, put it in one platoon in 1 week or whatever it was, and that's it. And that's when I came up with the 2 armies. There was an army that we came up with that you would never recognize, and then the army that had those kind of issues. Later on, it was a leadership issue. The rotational issue came into effect. I mean, the 6-month rotations were still there. People were more concerned about staying alive than they were about fighting. My first year there, we were more concerned about fighting, and the staying alive came with good fighting.
Can you describe significant actions that you witnessed or operations in which you participated?
Yeah. The first one was pre-Tet, and we were actually patrolling north of Benoit, and I was out there as a recon platoon leader, and Dave Grange, what he used to do is he used to throw us out there and he goes, go find the bad guys. And we had a very, very bad habit of finding them. And it was a mid-January, and we were put into it, and we went into an incredible firefight. And I remember telling my platoon sergeant at the time, Wendell Corsi, I said, and I called him back into Grange. I said, I don't know what we got, but we're in one hell of a fight. And I said, we're going to have to pull back, get to an LZ, because by that time I had lost 2 of my 3 squad leaders that were killed or severely wounded. Actually, one was blinded, the other was killed. And we pulled back to it, and he piled in, and we piled in with the other rifle companies. And I couldn't figure out what had happened. I said, I don't know what's going on, but I said, this was incredible. And we pushed back into the fight. Grange had said, okay, you've got a lot of casualties, why don't you fall to the back? I said, no, we're going back in. And we went back in, led the battalion back in, because I knew where we were in. And we found this enormous base camp. And they had, by that time, evacuated. So there's a connection here. So 2-3 weeks later, I get waking up in the middle of the night and said, pack your gear. I said, this is Tet. We don't fight over Tet. At that time, people didn't realize, but there was actually a ceasefire over Tet. And we actually were involved in the Tet offensive, went in there. Well, fast forward. Later I found out what had happened is that first action, we had run into the flank of the Dong Nai Regiment. And the Dong Nai Regiment was moving south to attack Benoit and Saigon with their companies. And we had run smack into them. And their job was to break contact, and our job was to maintain contact. So they put on a full course to just drive us back. And then we came in with the rest of them, they were basically gone. And I could never figure out why they didn't stay and fight. Of course, later I found out what happened is we had a movement to contact. We had made contact. They were trying to break contact because they didn't want to get discovered going forward, put in there. So in the space of 3 weeks, we'd have the contact in War Zone D, then TET, which we had moved into. At that time, we actually had to fight through our way to Benoit. Air Base had been nearly overrun, and we fought there on the ground outside of Benoit, which was pretty significant engagement. And then at that time, the fights just continued because then we were fighting not rearguard actions, but they were there, we were there, and we were trying them off the battlefield. But those were if I had to pick two, those were the two that started, to me, the year of TET, when the casualties started increasing. And by the time TET had finished, I didn't have one of my original squad leaders at all. 2 had been killed, 1 blinded. My platoon sergeant and I were the only 2 still standing. And by that time, the other 3 recon platoon leaders had been killed or wounded by that time.
Talk about your most vivid memories of your 2 tours in Vietnam.
The one that, probably the first contact we ever had was, it's kind of pretty brutal, close in gunfight. Because then it was no kidding, and you were close in with Chinese claymores going off and the close in gunfight. And then later, the Tet Offensive, which stands out in my mind. And it's something that you read from World War II, there's no atheist in a foxhole. And it's an interesting story, because we came out of the Benoit fight, and Grange had pulled us offline, and we went back to the base camp, and we kind of sat down and looked around at what was left of us. And this is going to sound crazy, but to this day it strikes me, and I said, you appreciate this. So a Catholic priest came by, and he said, do you want to have service? And now I had a multi-denominational platoon. Every one of them went to church. Every one of them took Catholic communion. And I thought to myself, I told people later, I said, that old World War II axiom that you hear that there's no atheist in a foxhole? Yeah, I saw it up close and personal. And it was, very, very sobering to me that we realized how fragile life was and how getting shot at and everything else, which it. And then what, and this has nothing to do with Vietnam, but the most striking thing I remembered about Vietnam wasn't what happened in Vietnam. Was happened after I came back from the Gulf War. And I marched in the Victory Parade here in Washington, D.C. and in New York City. And the first thing I did, I said, when we got on the airplane, which was a United Air flight, coming back from Iraq, the airplane was decorated and treated as conquering heroes. I said, we didn't see that in Vietnam, and you had to appreciate that. And then the appreciation of the American people, which I think was directly representative of what they had seen or not seen 20 years before on that.
Describe the best day you had during your time
going
in
home.
Vietnam. Going home. I'm going to ask you for details on that later.
But probably the best, because at that time I didn't realize it, probably one of the best days was Thanksgiving Day, when I realized that, the Army serves you real turkey, and that came in things called Mermite cans.
Yeah.
But they came out, and we had hot turkey. I said, hey,
and you were out in the boonies.
I was out in the middle of War Zone D, in the middle of a hill.
And you got hot turkey.
And I had hot
stuffing.
turkey. I said, I don't believe this. I think that first gunfight, and it was the worst day because seeing people you deployed with dead, and I mean mangled, realizing that, because at that time, up until that time, we had been in a couple skirmishes, but it wasn't anything. But it was the first time that it was, when you realize that people that you were with are dead, and it was not only the worst day, but it was also probably the best day, because at that time I said, boy, we're really pretty good. I mean, nobody folded, nobody did something dumb. everybody stood and fought. So it was the worst day in that we had lost people, but it was the best day because I saw the soul of the American infantry, and it was pretty cool in retrospect. And by the way, to this day, those from those platoon, and we've stayed in contact, remember that day. I've got a gentleman by the name of, he was a Spec 4 named Russell, who sends me Christmas cards every year. And he said, and to this day, you know, he remembers that.
Have you visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial here in D.C.?
Oh, I have, yeah.
What are your impressions when you go there?
Well, the first time was pretty emotional because, as you know, that the people are racked and stacked on the wall by the day they died.
Yeah.
So you can find, the first time I found my platoon there, they were all together. And
that's stunning.
yeah. Uh-huh. Over time, it goes away.
Yeah.
But the first time was really hard.
Yeah.